Hello and welcome to episode number 248 of the Armin Show podcast. I am here with Dr. Nicholas P. Money of Miami University in Ohio, author of The Selfish Ape. Welcome to the show.
I'm good to talk with you, Harman.
This is a wonderful thing.
A potentially excessively dispiriting subject, namely our coming extinction.
This is true. For all people, 7.8 billion, whatever it is, it could be a heavy thing. Now, this book is different from your previous books. I looked at your previous books a lot, focused on mycology, microbial universes, and not so much human nature and people specifically. What caused the transition to this broader category than specific of like mushrooms?
That's an interesting question because I spent a good 30 years of the bulk of my adult life, I suppose, to this point, studying fungal biology. And most of the books, the previous books that I've written have dealt with different aspects of fungal diversity and fungal biology. And I suppose in a sense, this is an example of a late midlife crisis, perhaps. I describe myself to students now as a recovering mycologist. You know, I've studied the fungi for so long, but it finally occurred to me that maybe I should think about what I've learned about myself and our species from studying this other kingdom of organisms for so long. And it really was a passion and an obsession for me, beginning as an undergraduate many years ago and then studying the fungi. But I do find myself now drawn to these wider questions, wider biological questions, and also questions in, I suppose, more philosophical, even theological questions, maybe at the age of 57.
When I think of 57, I think of 19 times 3. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Long live math. Now, one thing that I always like to focus on is we always go into a certain category for something that matches our personality, or we like it because of something we saw early on in life. What led you into specifically fungal studies?
That's really interesting. I think it's been pointed out to me often that I am somewhat nihilistic in my outlook, if it's possible to be a positive nihilist. Nihilist, I think so. So I have had students that have said that there's some irony perhaps in somebody becoming an expert on fungal biology, organisms associated with decomposition, and so the process of I suppose with processes of death and decomposition, and then having this sort of rather bleak outlook on things about the path that we're on. But maybe there is some possibility of grace then that comes from that recognition, and we can talk about that. But in terms of the real sort of roots of this, I was very fortunate with my maternal grandmother would take my sister and I into the woods really on every opportunity that presented itself, and introduced me to the natural world as a young child in England. And so I think probably that's where this interest in forests began. And then the fungi didn't really make much sense to me, but I was aware that they were there. And my grandmother, Kate, would point out these beautiful fruit bodies. And so, yeah, I think it took hold early in my life, which seems to be a pretty common experience for biologists and other sort of natural historians, that there's some kind of mentor, an adult in their lives that introduces them to the splendors of nature. Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind is there were some songs when I heard them, for example, 20 years ago, I liked them a lot. And I thought, wow, this is a really nice moment that they came out. And now 20 years later, I still like those songs. And then you think back to the first time you heard them, how cool that was. Like, you identify with them. You didn't know you'd be listening to them 20 years later. If you saw some mushrooms early on, did you have a sense like, wait, I like these more than other things I've seen, like trees or something?
I'm not sure that that's the case. I found them strange in the sense that my grandmother, I suppose, and other adults didn't know much about them. They were mysterious in that sense, that they clearly weren't plants, they weren't animals, but what are these organisms? And then when I did go to university in England, one of the first professors that I had was a mycologist, and he began to explain how the fungi work, and that was really transformative, I think, for me, recognizing that these were a distinctive part of nature and that there was so much to learn about them.
One thing before I go more into the human level material, but related to it, what are some characteristics of fungi that we should take note of as people, or that we do as people, or similar paths that we are both following?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's this tendency among popularizers of mycology, of fungal biology, to speak about the strangeness of fungi and almost to suggest that they step outside from the normal bounds of biological behavior. I mean, I think these ideas are rooted in sort of much earlier superstitions related to hallucinogenic and poisonous mushrooms, and this has been carried into the 21st century again with some of these popularizers that suggest that mushrooms can save the planet, that medicinal mushrooms can cure our ills. There's very little basis for any of this in science. I think what's interested me more in my career is really understanding the way in which the fungi have come up with unique solutions to common challenges, the common challenges in biology. How do I move? How do I move around? Being anthropomorphic here, but the fungus says, how am I going to get dispersed? How am I going to move away from the parent colony? How am I going to feed? How am I going to reproduce? I mean, these are, how will I deal with predators? How will I deal with pests? These are questions that face, challenges that face every living organism. The fungi have come up with unique solutions, beautiful examples of evolutionary engineering to actually answer these challenges. But I mean, you could apply the same thing to, if I'd become a jellyfish expert, I'm pretty confident that there's very interesting ways in which jellyfish have solved exactly the same problems.
Path to revolution, where you have to adapt, and only those that adapt continue, and the other ones, they're out. One thing I noted was that you have pioneered high-speed video microscopy to see the explosive mechanisms used by fungi to launch spores into the air. How did you produce that, or did you team up with like video production experts, or how does that work?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I had a colleague, a younger mycologist. Her name is Anne Pringle. She's now at University of Wisconsin, and she actually contacted me. This is a good number of years ago now, when she was a postdoc, and she was more alert to the technological innovations that had happened within high-speed video than I was at the time. And so that was actually how it began, was with teaming up with her. And that was a really, really exciting period in research. So about a little more than 10 years ago now, when suddenly these cameras they sort of became affordable enough, at least to rent these cameras, capable of capturing a million frames of information a second. And so what I recognized was there were all of these long-standing questions about fungal movements that had been researched by earlier generations of researchers, but nobody had been able to see what was happening, just because there was no way of slowing down these incredibly fast spore launches, for example. And so that was really a very exciting period during my research career of really seeing the way that things worked for the first time. There have been these very clever inferences made about the way that fungi would shoot their spores into the air through these explosive jets, pressurized jets of fluid, but we were actually able to slow this down using high-speed video technology and actually see frame by frame what was happening. And that still, I still find that inspiring. Actually looking at things. This is what's happening during 1 microsecond, and then a millionth of a second later, the structure that we're looking at has moved this far. I mean, it's really, it is utterly beautiful.
It's a nice thing to see. When I read that the first time, I thought of there's some popular YouTube channels that they slow down everything, and they'll like chop through a watermelon or whatever, and then they'll slow
Yeah,
it down.
yeah.
And that
Well,
wasn't
it's so
possible.
straightforward now, but I mean, at the time then, so we were
Right.
doing the first work that we published was about 2006, and then, but at that time it was nobody had been able to do this in a routine fashion. Now, of course, you can use a cell phone to get some interesting high-speed footage of things like insect movements, for example, and I guess with the iPhone now you can actually get some useful images of hummingbirds hovering and so forth. But you know, at the time we were doing this, this was cutting edge.
I noticed one theme across the book that relates to the individual who is on the front of the book, who I think of as like one of the forefront of science in the evolutionary category, Richard Dawkins. And I noticed that theme across your book where you talk about a feature that an organism took into account, how that kept it going, and then the traits that they ended an evolutionary tree and didn't continue forward. How long have you always looked at organisms and their path in this way? How early did you look at evolutionary adaptation?
Well, I was I mean, I read as a high school student, I suppose, 1976, 77. I mean, I read Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene back then, and I can't claim to have understood it all at that stage in my education, but I was fascinated with this, and I found it over time as my understanding of evolutionary theory deepened. It became an enthralling and totally compelling way of looking at nature. So I've never left that. I mean, I don't think before then, it's not like I had any space for what? Any space for a God. There was no really God of the gaps for me, but it was very nice to, I think, find in Richard Dawkins a writer of such brilliance that he could really explain. It seemed to me that he explained life, the universe, and everything, at least as a teenage reader. Yeah, and I'm not sure I've changed my opinion. I mean, there are certainly we understand a lot more than we did in 1976, but Richard Dawkins got an awful lot right.
Mm-hmm. That's still basically one of my favorite books in the science category from the beginning.
Yeah,
I liked it a lot. Now, one thing I liked in the chapter related to food and how it starts, because a lot of your studies is microbial, small scale, and then you talk about how food starts with entropy and ends with sugar. Can you describe that transition and how we need other organisms and they are way more advanced than we might be?
So I suppose where do we start with that? I mean, there are theists that would claim, and you'll still see this online, this claim that in some way life, according to evolutionary principles, life according to biological principles is impossible because in some way it steps outside of the second law of thermodynamics, right? So everything, which means everything goes to shit, right, in the universe. And then here am I, something as glorious as this member of Homo sapiens. How can this be? There has to be some supernatural explanation for such magnificence. But the essential answer to that question is that we have to look at the larger system, and that we can see that the order that we find in nature is paid for by disorder elsewhere. And we can thermodynamically we can think about temperature, but I'm not going to go there now. But to answer your question specifically, then yeah, we've got the reactions within the sun. Then the hydrogen atoms fusing to form helium, and energy being released from the sun. Photons finally escaping, probably after hundreds of years from deep within the sun. And those photons, then some of them are captured by plants and photosynthetic bacteria, and through the wonders of photosynthesis, then plants at least are using that energy to capture carbon dioxide and incorporate the carbon atoms in carbon dioxide into sugars and other biological molecules. And and that's the source of the fuel that keeps us going every second, every microsecond of our lives. So I suppose I like thinking about things in those. In that case, we're looking at cosmic terms there, but things do make sense. I mean, the wonder of all wonders is, and the question of all questions is, how life got started in the first place, and there's a huge gap there in understanding how order did emerge and how we moved, how planet Earth transitioned from chemistry to biology. I mean, there's a whole series of interlinked, wonderfully complicated questions that have not been solved. But in broad terms, we know why we're here and how we got here. We just don't know that. We just don't know about the beginning, that first cell.
Small detail. You know, by the way, also, I think it was a week or two ago that the first pictures, the really detailed pictures of the sun with its plasma came out, and it looked really cool. And then that's
Yes.
the source of all
I
our
found
wonderful energy.
that being a biologist, I haven't spent much time looking through telescopes, but I did actually get a home telescope as a birthday present some years ago, and I've got a solar filter on that. And from time to time, I'll actually look at the sun, and I find it, I don't know, enthralling and terrifying at the same time. Not with the detail, of course, that was discussed in these news reports, but there's just I don't have the words at the moment to express it, but there's a lot going on there, isn't there, on the surface of the sun?
Makes us look so small, and then
Understatement of the year. There's an awful lot going on the surface of the sun. Well, yeah.
there are some reactions occurring there.
Yes, there's something useful going on there. Well done.
I've covered it all now. That's kind of cool. One thing I noted that you mentioned, and one thing I really liked about chapters, I always look at chapter details or subheadings or different things. The G concept, where every chapter is with a G: globe, genesis, guts, genes. That's a wonderful thing because it connects them all. And it was a way of going from the original to humanity in a way. But in your second chapter, you talk about how we are more similar to fungi than to plants or any major groupings of life. How is that the case?
Yeah, so we have known this now for quite a while through molecular phylogenetic studies. So if we compare the degrees of similarity and difference between organisms based upon their individual genes, and I mean now we can do this sort of at the genomic level, but there's been evidence now for since the 1980s really that the fungi and the animals share a more recent common ancestor than the fungi with the plants, or the animals with plants. Does that make sense? We're more closely related to fungi than we are to plants. Now that ancestor, that common ancestor, would have existed a billion years ago, plus or minus a few weeks. You know, we've got there is a big plus or minus there, but that's how we look at this relationship, is that a long time ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, probably a billion years ago, there was a common ancestor from which then the fungal kingdom and the animals emerged. And it's interesting that, and I think there would probably be many people that would unfamiliar with the science that would be impressed by that, interested, thinking that fungi were really plant-like. I mean, that was the way that they were seen, for the way that they were viewed by scientists, for example, in the 18th and 19th centuries, I suppose. So there's this genetic similarity, but there's also similarity, and that genetic similarity is expressed too structurally in that if we think about cells with cilia, and there are aquatic fungi that live in ponds and lakes and so forth, and they have swimming cells called zoospores that look a little bit like an animal sperm cell, but they've got a tail that pushes them through the water. And so it's a posterior tail, a posterior flagellum that pushes the cell through fluid. We see the same thing, of course, with an animal sperm cell. That's the only place in nature where we see that structure, which is really interesting. There's lots of other ways of arranging cilia, and when there's one cilium, we tend to call it a flagellum. There are other kinds of cells, single cell microbes that swim through water, but they might be decorated with cilia over their entire surface, or maybe they've got one pointing forward that kind of drags the cell through the water. But the only place that we see that particular signature of the posterior flagellum is within the animals and fungi. And that structural signature was actually recognized before any of the molecular work was done. I think the person that did that was his name's Thomas Cavalier Smith, recognized this, and this was back in the early 1980s, I believe, and was based on just looking at this and saying, yeah, probably the fungi and the animals have this sisterhood, this alliance, which it's a pretty smart insight. Well done. I heard him speak many years ago, but anyway, it's pretty good before the genetic data supported it. And then also we see the fact that we're ciliated too, because it's not just sperm cells. We see, I mean, most cells are ciliated in the human body, even if they don't have an active waggling cilium. But we've also got active waggling cilia in our respiratory tract, and I'm coughing a little here today, in our nasal passages, in our nervous system, brain ventricles, and so forth, fallopian tubes, if you have them, that we've ciliated structures are everywhere. And there's very interesting work too in biomedical research and looking at human diseases, including different forms of cancer that may well have defective cilia as their foundation. Absolutely fascinating. So you go back 1 billion years, this structure evolves, and then it's carried through today, and perhaps in some pretty serious ailments that we develop.
Mm-hmm. I like that portion when you were discussing it, the one where it had tail, but also it had I think a middle portion where it served like two purposes, where it was for movement and also processing through it, like a double purpose.
Oh, yeah. So a very simple. If we go back, it's actually outside the animal kingdom, but so the choanoflagellates, these colored flagellates, yeah. So they also have that structure. Then this single flagellum, and they'll use it both for movement and for feeding, and depending on the species that we're looking at, some use it more for movement and feeding, and vice versa. But yeah, very interesting.
I think it's kind of cool when it's like multiple features. It kind of reminds me of also when talking about, I think it was birds. Like if you created things from scratch, as we do with like an airplane, we go for the most efficient thing, but evolution might go to step A and then later step B works. And so step B came from step A, which we wouldn't have normally done if we were building it from scratch. But then the feathers that were for warmth are now for flying or something like that. It's a nice combo you can see.
Yeah. I mean, we see this throughout nature, that it doesn't. It's not the obvious linear path that we first think about. I mean, that's certainly the case, isn't it? With the evolution of feathers, it was, with the recognition that so many of the dinosaurs were feathered, even though these were flightless animals. Yeah, fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the chapter on guts, I read one book called Pleased to Meet Me by Bill Sullivan. He studies a lot of gut bacteria and things like that, which I find quite interesting. And you mentioned there's so much digestive area in the gut, 30 square meters, which is huge. What kind of, have you done any research on microbes in the gut, or what might exist in there and how it's important to us?
I mean, I've been interested in research on the human microbiome for a long time. I mean, as this has developed, I'm interested. From my own my own interest in the fungi, I am interested in the organisms other than bacteria and archaea that are in the human gut, and actually what they're doing. And there's still some controversy there. It's possible that a lot of those fungi are not doing anything particularly useful, that they're passing through the gut, that they're present on the foods that we eat and so forth, and this might be the case. But there's probably also some fungi that play an important and poorly understood role in our digestive system. Yeah, different kinds of yeast, for example, that are there, that are, every stool sample that you look at, you'll find these organisms. So they're probably doing something.
We talk later about, in the genes chapter, about enzymes and how they have been formed like almost perfectly over time to speed up reactions a millionfold or whatever it might be. Are there any similar enzymes between us and fungi, or are there any specific enzymes you have looked at and studied?
Well, I mean, there's one of the important. I mean, we don't possess any cellulases, right? We
Oh,
can't
yeah,
we
completely.
can't digest the cellulose,
Right.
the fiber in our diet, because we lack these enzymes. But the fungi are excessively capable at breaking down cellulose. I mean, if you look at think about a shelf fungus that's growing from a decaying log, it may well be deriving a lot of its nutrition from breaking down cellulose, but also other large other macromolecules that are present in wood. I'm thinking of the lignins. But I mean, cellulose is pure. It's a polymer of glucose. There's a heck of a lot of energy in it, but we can't break it down at all. It provide to actually grist for the mill. It enables us to move stuff through the gut. So we need to have fiber in our diet, even though we can't use it, but can't use it nutritionally, can't use it as a source of calories. But that's interesting that the fungi, and actually there's a lot of interesting work on looking at the timing of that. When was it that the fungi began to develop this capacity to decompose wood, and were fungi present on the land before, perhaps long before there were any woody tissues? And the answer is almost certainly yes. So that's an interesting area of mycological research, looking at the evolution of wood decomposition. Yeah.
Hmm. And then now transitioning to people and our large scale, what we are doing. Are we destroying the planet? Are we going to make it? What does it look like moving forward as far as heating and or the greenhouse gases?
I mean, I have a I think well, I've named the book, the subtitle, Our Path to Extinction. I don't think there is. I don't think there is a good path. We've put an extra teraton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere um, since the middle of the 18th century, since the middle of the beginning of the industrial revolution. We've bumped up the carbon dioxide concentration up there by, well, it depends what numbers you look at, but 48% maybe increase. It's a pretty significant increase in CO2. And the basics of the greenhouse effect are quite straightforward. And we're seeing the effects of this globally, obviously. And I mean, I can't remember the last time I read any good news about the environment. And that strikes me. I mean, I think I have an ethical responsibility as a professor and working with young students, people who've got many decades of life ahead of them, in talking with them about these issues. But I don't think we do any. I think being Pollyanna-ish is foolhardy. I think it's probably best to actually look at this, the problems that we face, very objectively, and then think about what our response to these changes will be. But I see the changes, and mine is just one viewpoint. It'd be wonderful if I'm completely wrong, but I don't think so. I'm obviously an atmospheric chemist, but I mean, anecdotally, the changes that I've seen in southwestern Ohio, where I've lived for 25 years, and again, this is anecdotal, but the changes in insects that I see, I mean, again, going back to my grandmother in the woods, I'm a keen observer of wildlife. The changes have been really, really profound in the area where I live over that quarter century. And it's anecdotal. This is just me going out into the garden and into the woods every day and looking at things. But I mean, my observations mesh perfectly with these large scale studies in different parts of the world, looking at insect diversity in terms of the different species, also looking at just populations, number of insects. So things are changing. And one has to wonder, what could we do that would actually alter this course? What could we do that would change things? And So you can do a thought experiment. We can think that there's a young genius out there that's going to come up with some mechanism for mopping up lots and lots of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases really quickly. If we think about that from a biological or I suppose a social sciences perspective, what effect would that have? So we go through a period of planetary cooling because we absorb the carbon dioxide. What it means is that we keep doing what we've been doing for the last many decades, which is to live the lives of relatively wealthy consumers. I suppose I'm speaking about myself here, and I'm a terrible sinner in that department, right? I love stuff. I buy stuff. I'm a consumer, and I'm in my adopted country of the United States of America. I'm a terrible, terrible influence on the planet, on the health of the planet. And if we cool things, it means that I'll keep doing what I'm doing. And it also means that there'll be more of us doing what I'm doing or wanting to do what I do. I find it extraordinary that the human population is not discussed by most of the major figures that opine on climate change. You don't hear this very often. So we're looking at there's lots of very interesting and clever things that are said about climate change at these international conferences. But boy, human population isn't mentioned very, very much. And as our numbers grow, what is it that's going to actually change the way that we live in terms of our export of the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels into the atmosphere? I mean, last year we contributed more in terms of tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than probably any other year in human history. So it's not like things are getting better. We're researching alternative fuels, and that's one of the things that's interested me a lot, is actually bioethanol production using yeast, which I have written a book on yeast called The Rise of Yeast. To cut to the chase here, no, I don't see a lot of good news. And like most biologists, I'm reading about this every day, looking at effects upon ecosystems and of climate change, looking at marine resources. Yeah, I think the future looks pretty bleak. So the question is, what do I do with that information? Mm-hmm. What do I do with that personally? I look in the mirror in the morning and sort of curse myself for my terrible behavior. But I think what I do in the Selfish Ape is to lay out a biological argument about why we've acted in this fashion. And to some extent, I think it's inevitable. I mean, that's our out here, is mm-hmm. we're performing according to our biological and evolutionary edicts. And I'm not sure that we could have behaved much better.
It's like
in the book, I do another thought experiment where I'm thinking about aliens that are watching us, right? A classroom on, I don't know where it would be. It's up there, and they're watching us, from Proxima Centauri or something. Of course, they got the delay, haven't they? If they're using a really powerful telescope, there's a Proxima Centauri is 4 light years away, so they're seeing us in 2016 at the moment. So, but I think that very smart aliens out there will have studied other Goldilocks planets and actually seen a life cycle to each of those planets once some species arises that's actually capable of changing the chemistry of the planet. Changing the chemistry of the planet very, very swiftly. Clearly, there have been periods in the evolutionary history of Earth where microorganisms have really transformed the chemistry of the planet. We can think about the evolution of photosynthetic cyanobacteria that are the source of the oxygen in the atmosphere. But in any case, those aliens looking at us with their noodly appendages from this Goldilocks planet, and they say, well, what stage are they at? And I do this thing. I think about all the children in the classroom raising their noodly appendages, because they know, they've studied this. It's in their textbooks on cosmology and life in the universe, and they can see that what stage we're at. And I do wonder if that's where we are, and therefore there's not much that we're going to do now that's going to put us on a path that will enable at least this form of humanity, the civilization that we've enjoyed for the at the moment, in the 21st century, that this isn't sustainable. So that's not a particularly creative viewpoint. There's plenty of people that feel rather bleakly about things. What I find extraordinary, though, is even among my colleagues, fellow biologists, that they don't really think about this.
Huh.
It's like, we never really thought about it that way. Boy, are we doomed? Are you 415 parts per million carbon dioxide, fires in Australia, fires in Scandinavia in last summer and the summer before. I mean, this is, it's not good.
This is true.
Profound point of the day. It's not good. We're doomed.
It has always, I've noticed that there's always been a trend when something is occurring, there's a thought like, oh, we'll just pull back. I've never seen humanity or any organism pull back. There's usually something else that comes up. Like, let's say the education system is not great. It's not like it's pulled back and adjusted back to a functional form. Usually something else will overtake it, and if there is room for that. So I agree with that. We don't usually have something that reins in what is occurring. I've never seen that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that I mean, there are some really interesting trends out there, right? So in many countries, people are eating less meat. That seems like a very useful thing to do for a lot of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is with population growth continuing,
right.
And even though the rates are slowing, I mean, we're still looking at United Nations looking at about 10 billion people within a few decades.
Mm-hmm.
Many things aren't going to get better on that score anytime soon. Population will decrease after that, but it's I'd love to know where the good news is. I mean, I see it in the behavior of individuals thinking, and especially among my students that think about this very, very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are changing their lifestyles in a way that they believe will help foster a better future. So you see this at the level of individuals, and I think that's beautiful. I think we see the best of humanity there. But overall, as a species, not so much.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to counter that. I like that you did include a chapter about how we make things better, which we do have some ways we are looking at. But the larger trend seems to be like an avalanche of sorts. So it makes sense the way you're describing
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I think we do. Humans have achieved extraordinary things through science, for example, and also artistically.
Mm-hmm.
One can make the argument, though, of course, that scientific advances are part of the foundation for the decline and fall of Homo sapiens, right? That this is what's enabled us to increase in numbers. This is what's actually created the carbon-based global economy.
Mm-hmm.
These are glorious intellectual achievements, but there's a huge downside associated with them, at least in terms of what the longevity of what we'd like to think is intelligent life.
Mm-hmm. Part of me almost thinks some of the people who originated the ideas did not intend for them to be, let's say, multiplied 100x in some category the way they were. They were just trying to combine features, and we figured out this.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, you can think about that. I mean, think about many of the great engineers of the 19th century and well, great engineers throughout history, and these remarkable achievements and ways in which and through their inventions the way that they've improved the experience of being alive, the ability to travel at high speed, for example. The trouble is that there is obviously a downside associated with that, which is that we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. This is true. One thing I wanted to come to a near close on is early on you were in England and now you're in the United States. Is there any difference in the research capacity there and or here in your field? And do you have any scientists you liked in either region?
I mean, there are just talking about research in general, I suppose within my my field of expertise, fungal biology. There are challenges on both sides of the Atlantic. Just in terms of acquiring funding, I mean, I can think about, it's a longer topic of conversation, but if we think about the effects of Brexit, Britain's withdrawal, United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union, I mean, this will have profound effects upon European collaborations, international collaborations, supported by European funding. So that's a specific challenge there. In this country, I think probably the primary problem that we face really is that we seem to live in an age where there's less interest in science, less support for objective truth, and so it's not an exaggeration to say that science is under attack in this country. We've still got a great deal of federal funding for research in this country, although it's increasingly difficult to compete for that. But I think it's I see that social challenge maybe being more important, the way that as a society, with so much powerful science produced by American scientists over such a long period of time, world leaders, and that the fact that we might be ceding control of that is unfortunate.
Right. And then lastly, are there any specific scientists or one that you have looked up to over time, or that you like working with in some form that comes to mind?
No, only myself.
Oh.
I got no time for anybody else. No, I mean, it's been my great fortune to have worked with some really interesting scientists. I actually spent part of January. I visited one of my mentors, a man called Frank Harold. He's a retired biochemist. He lives in a retirement assisted living facility in Seattle now, and he's actually become very, very interested over the years in the origin of life, the generation of the first cell. So that was absolutely fascinating to interact with him, as I did just a few weeks ago. And I find that glorious that I hope he won't mind me mentioning this. Frank's an older man now, let's say, since he was my postdoc advisor in the 1980s, he would have to be. But I mean, he still has that joy of discovery, and he still has that passion for science and reading the work of other scientists. And I can't think of many professions where people, if they live very privileged lives such that they get to engage in research, scientific research, but transferring that love of their vocation throughout their lives. I mean, I don't know many lawyers very well, but are there many in the legal profession that would say that are still poring over legal tracts in their 90s? I mean, maybe there are. I suspect there are some legal scholars that do this, but I see that in scientists, and I think that's the best of it. When you see somebody like me, I suppose, getting hooked on science as a child, and then actually transferring that love of discovery and love of learning throughout their lives. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I do like that feature. I would like to say I've been glad to have you on this episode number 248 of the Armin Show. A lot of information. It tells us about people, where we might be going, and how it connects to things that are much smaller than what we normally look at, like mushrooms or sponges or microbes, which is wonderful. Glad to have you on.
Oh, it's my pleasure talking with you. Very interesting conversation we've had, I think.
I would agree with that. And we are out.